All right, we're live. Just checking the stream. All right, well, I see by the clock that it's 10 after 4, so we should probably get started. No, it's just after 6:30, so maybe let's go ahead. And today was the Volunteer Ministry Center Carry the Torch luncheon. Some of you were there. And when they took the covers off the plates, everybody at our table began eating. And we were several bites into our lunch when the person got up and said, before we eat, we're going to have an invocation. And we all kind of chuckled. But I said, well, we Presbyterians are used to having the prayer after we eat. So that's what we're going to do right now, is have the prayer after we eat or while we are eating. So let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for this bounty that has been set before us by the wonderful members of this congregation. May you use this food to nourish us so we can serve you in the world. We make this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. So welcome to all of you who are watching us virtually, either live or later. And hopefully this will be helpful to you. But just a warning to you virtually, when we have question and answers, we don't have a two-way stream here, so you won't be able to ask questions. I'll be sure and repeat questions that we hear from people in the room. How y'all doing? Got to put your jacket back on there, Janice. Some of you know that here at Second there's a big boiler in the basement, and that boiler controls the sanctuary, the Mary Chambers room, and the fellowship hall, and it can either be set to heat or air. And it takes a lot to switch it over. We have to have somebody come out and switch it over. So we try to do it as late as possible in the fall in case we get one of those, what do they call them, blackberry winter? No, that's in the spring. Indian summers, yeah. In case we get that, we don't want to have it switched over to heat. So that usually doesn't happen until November, and so that's why it's chilly in here. We can't turn on the heat because it's still set to air. We didn't know we were going to get this cold snap. So, well, thank you for coming. I'm glad that you are here. I hope this will be worth your time as I share this with you. I think it's important for pastors in general, when they go on a sabbatical, to come back and make a report to the congregations that they serve, because it is the congregations that support and allow them to have the sabbatical in the first place. And you all were not only kind enough to continue paying me while I was on sabbatical, you even put a sabbatical line item into the budget. And so since a lot of the travel that I did you paid for, I figured I ought to tell you about it. But also so that you can hear what sabbatical did for me, and I will give you the spoiler alert. It did what it should have done, and I'll explain that later. I do have to say, I do feel a bit awkward up here because at the Volunteer Ministry Center luncheon, we heard a wonderful person speak who is engaged in a ministry to women in Nashville, and she spoke for a long time with great effervescence about all that she had done for people who were hurt and abused and downtrodden and oppressed. And now I got to get up here and talk about what I did on my summer vacation. So I might feel a little guilty about that, but anyway. So you may remember that my last Sunday in May was the week before Memorial Day. I left here, I think the service ended around noon. Who are we kidding? I was preaching. It was afternoon. And I got in the car and kissed my wife goodbye and drove to Hilton Head, South Carolina. And thanks to Terry and Kay Weaver, who offered me the use of their timeshare there, I spent the first week of my sabbatical on vacation playing golf with two of my friends and my brother who joined me there during the week. A friend of mine had told me a while back had given me a piece of advice that turned out to be great. He said, look, he goes, whatever you do on your sabbatical, go away for the first week. Go away somewhere. Otherwise, you'll be antsy. And that was good advice. So I didn't stay around here and wonder, what am I going to do with myself? I arranged to be gone and play golf. And that was the beginning of a lot of golf this summer. When I went to the pastoral relations team with my first sabbatical proposal of everything that I wanted to do on my sabbatical, they rejected that proposal. And they said, it's too much work and not enough play. We want to see you come back with something that is more equally divided between rest and relaxation and work. And so I came back with a second proposal, which they accepted, and that included playing golf as much as possible, because that's relaxing to me, it's restful to me. To those of you who play golf, I will let you know, for those of you who will understand this, that my handicap went from an 18 to a 13 by the end of the summer. So I was able to get a lot of time in on the golf course in different places. So that was Hilton Head. And then I came back, and my plan for June was to just decompress, just to not do any work other than those work things that I needed to do around the house. But just unplug, decompress, and just, I hate this language, but get in touch with myself again. Just sort of remember who I am as a person apart from who I am as a pastor. And so some of that was structured and some of it was unstructured. But I want to tell you about two of the structured things that I did in June. My wife and I went for a week to the island of Bonaire.
Okay. I was like, I better not be in a bikini.
Yeah, you're up there.
No, I'm not in a bikini.
No. Bonaire is one of the ABC islands in the Caribbean. The other two are very well known, Aruba and Curacao. But Bonaire is much lesser known because it is an ugly island. It is not tropical by any stretch of the imagination. And pretty much the only thing to do there is scuba dive. So people who are not scuba divers generally don't go to Bonaire. They go to one of the other two islands. We are scuba divers, however, or at least we used to be. And when the pastoral relations team said, do things that are more restful and relaxing, I told Tuesday that, other than golf, I think the most relaxing thing I've ever done in my life is scuba dive. When we worked on the cruise ships, we scuba dived 3-4 times a week. So it used to be something that we did a lot. We had not done it in about 10 years. And that time we did it, Tuesday kind of freaked out and said, I'm never doing it again. So when I said, I'd like to go for a week and do nothing but scuba dive, she was like, I don't think so. But we signed up for a refresher course over here on Sutherland Avenue, and that made us feel much more comfortable. Bonaire, most of the diving sites are right off the shore. And there are, I think, 70 different dive sites around the island where you just walk into the water and go. You can take a boat and do some, and we did that. But mostly we just scuba dive there at the island. And what I want to say is by the end of the week, she was more relaxed and comfortable with it than even I was. She was putting the stuff together and planning our trips and whatnot. But if you look in this picture down here on the lower left, that was the home reef, they called it, and one of the dive sites on the island. So what they would do is they would just put tanks out in the morning, and you would have your little wheelbarrow with your gear in it, and you would go over and get a tank and hook your gear up to the tank and then just walk into the ocean and scuba dive. And the great thing about Bonaire is, as brown and ugly and dry as it is above, you go under the surface of the water and it is teeming with life and color, and it's just the most amazing contrast that you can imagine. We never did get a good sunset though, because there was some volcanic eruption that caused ash to be in the Gulf Stream, and so the sunset was murky every night. But it was still a lovely week away with my bride of 29 years, and it was a very restful and relaxing occasion. I think we sent this picture up here on the top right. We sent that to Sarah Morgan right about the time that you would have been passing the peace on Sunday morning. With peace be with you, here we are. So, came back and just did kind of nothing around the house, just all those little projects, odds and ends that you pile up over time. And then we took the kids and we went to Universal Studios, which was not restful and was not relaxing, but was a heck of a lot of fun. And we had a good time there. I don't have a picture of this. I should have downloaded this. When my children, when each of them finished the 5th grade, I took them to Washington, D.C. for a week to just show them, the Capitol and delve into the history of the United States and the government and all of that. And when I took Seth, we went to the Smithsonian, and in the Smithsonian they had a piece of the Berlin Wall. And of course, me being the age I am, seeing a piece of the Berlin Wall really made me very emotional. And I said to Seth, I can't believe that is a piece of the Berlin Wall. And he looked at me and he said, what's the Berlin Wall? So, that's the reality he's grown up in. Well, we were leaving the park one day, and he was on his phone, and he was scrolling, and he was scrolling. He was like, hey, guys, follow me. And he started walking, and we were like, what, where are we going? It's been a long day. He goes, I got something I want to show you. So we went to the Hard Rock Cafe, and then he walked around behind the Hard Rock Cafe, and behind the Hard Rock Cafe at Universal Studios is a 10-foot tall, 4-foot wide section of the Berlin Wall, just sitting there. And he had Googled secrets of Universal and had found it out, and he was so proud to take us and show us that. And of course, then Lily said, what's the Berlin Wall? But it was a nice week with the kids. Coming back, we were in the car for 12 hours. We were going to stop and spend the night south of Atlanta, but we stopped for supper, and the kids wanted to keep going. Seth said, well, a friend of mine's getting married tomorrow, and I'd like to get back for that. And Lily said, yeah, and my friends want to see me. So we drove all the way in 12 hours. 2 days later, Seth came down with COVID. So we thought for sure we were all going to get it, and we didn't. So I don't know how we managed that. But so that was June. June was just figuring out who I was again. In July, I began doing a lot of research, a lot of reading. Here are some of the books I read. I read probably twice that much on Kindle. I actually did some reading in June, but the reading I did in June was all fiction. It was all reading for fun, which I had not done in a while. I read those silly beach reads that you read, and an Anne Lamott book, but I love Anne Lamott. But in July, I began really reading for theology and pastoral work, and it was such a gift to be able to read and then just reflect on what I had read, because I realized for the last many years, anytime I read a book, I'm thinking, how can I use this with a session? How can I use this in a sermon? How can I use this in a Bible study? And the chance to just read something and then sit quietly and reflect on it and think about it and let it challenge me and let it nourish me was a gift that I had not expected when I went into this. It's something that in my normal routine I should make time for, but don't. So I really enjoyed my reading. It was also in July that I began to work on my book. And I think I said this the other day. I've got about 15 chapters of it done, at least in rough first draft form. I hope to have 20. 20 is my goal. So now I'm working on those other 5. Some of you have asked what the book is going to be, and I got to figure out an elevator speech for this one, because you're you ought to be able to sum it up in one sentence, and I can't really do that yet. But what in my mind I'm calling it the fatherhood of God, reflections on the nature of God from a father, which sounds just so long and boring. So hopefully, if I can find somebody who will publish it, their marketing department will come up with a much catchier title. But essentially it's this. When I was a senior in seminary was when Seth was born. He was born halfway through my senior year. And so, of course, in your last year of seminary, you're thinking theologically about everything. And so for the first few months of his life, things would happen, and I would think, oh, well, this must be what it's like for God. I realized that up until I had a child, the only part of the parent-child relationship I had had was from the child's perspective. So in my relationship with God, I had only ever viewed it from the child's perspective. But as a father, I began to experience the parent-child relationship from the parent's perspective, and then I began to say, oh, well, that must be what it's like for God in our relationship with God. So that's what the book is about. Each chapter is something that happened in one of our children's life and how Tuesday or I responded as parents, and then relating that to what it must be like for God in our relationship. And so, there's one about grace, and there's one about control, and so on and so forth. And you heard the one about commandment. You heard about rules just a couple of weeks ago in the sermon on the Ten Commandments. I said at the end of the service, it was basically a chapter in my book. It wasn't a verbatim, but a large part of that, especially all the stuff about how we gave our kids rules and we expected those rules to be followed. There's more in the chapter, which I didn't want to go into because it was a long enough sermon anyway. But then about how what happens, what happened when our children broke the rules. Because we have one child who never wanted to break the rule. We said don't go in the street, and he didn't go closer than 2 feet to the curb. And then we had another child who we said don't go in the street, and she would go right up to the curb and look at you and go. So what are the consequences of breaking the rules and that sort of thing? So we go into that and what that's like from God's perspective and how those are teachable moments. So that's what the book is about. And I worked on that all through July and August. In August, I did a lot of traveling, and I was able to work on it a lot. I'll explain that in a moment. But the plan is to finish the book this fall and winter, do some refining of it, and then next summer, the sermon series for the summer will be The Fatherhood of God. And the idea is that each week I'll turn a chapter into a sermon, and that will help me really refine it and rewrite it, and then send it off to publishers beginning in the fall. And it would make a great Father's Day gift. So maybe get it published before June of 2024. So that's the plan. We'll see. I don't know. Nobody may buy it. You may be the only ones who ever hear it, but I enjoyed writing it. So then towards the end of July and then throughout August, I really delved into what I had been researching. I became really interested in congregations that had experienced a split. I mentioned this a little bit in the sermon a few weeks ago. There's lots of different kinds of splits, and congregations split from the denomination in lots of different ways. What I found and what I knew just from my experience is that there are a lot of congregations who just left the denomination between 2011 and 2014. They didn't want to be Presbyterian anymore. Their congregations had a vote, and it was usually 95 to 100% in favor of leaving, and they left. Most of those were very rural congregations that were much smaller, and extremely large urban congregations like Highland Park Presbyterian in Dallas or Menlo Park Presbyterian in San Francisco. Then there are a lot of congregations that had a lot of people leave around that time who got frustrated with what was going on in the denomination, and people left the congregation to go to other churches. But the church never officially split. There was never a vote that was held as to whether or not the congregation should leave the denomination. There, as my research uncovered, were only 7 churches in the entire denomination that I could find that had a vote on leaving the denomination. And then the number that needed to vote yes was not reached. In most cases, it was around 75 or 80% needed to vote to leave, and that number was not reached. And so the Presbytery determined that the people who voted no would be the church. And then all of the people who wanted to leave left and started another church. I found 7, but 2 of them I discounted because one of them was in St. Paul, Minnesota, and after the vote, this small group was left with their church building and property and assets and ministry and name, and there was another Presbyterian church on the other side of town that had been struggling for a while, and they decided to merge, and they formed a brand new church out of that merger. So that wasn't really the same. So I didn't count them. And then there was another one in Kansas that after the split happened, a mega church called Village Park Presbyterian Church took them under their wing and made them a mission congregation. So they didn't have their own budget. That was the mega church. They didn't have their own pastor. The mega church sent pastors out there to preach. And so that really wasn't the same. So that left 5 of us where there was, and the terminology that the Presbytery used was a faithful remnant who stayed behind with the building and the property and the ministry, but was a much smaller group than preceded it. I was interested not necessarily in how the split happened, or what the split was about, or how the split occurred. What I was interested in is what has happened since then. What could we learn from each other in terms of how we are trying to cope with being the church differently than we used to be? And so that was really where my line of questioning went. But as a result, in each place they ended up talking about how the split occurred and all of that. So we're one of the 5, and I went to visit the other 4, all southern churches, or at least geographically. And the first one that we visited was Fountain Inn Presbyterian Church. That was the only one that Tuesday got to go with me to visit. And that's in Fountain Inn, South Carolina, which is halfway in between Greenville and Spartanburg, South Carolina. The Sunday we were there, the pastor had just gotten back from vacation and they were having a hymn sing. So I don't know that the attendance was usual, but they had about 50 in worship. I think prior to the split, they said they had anywhere between 150 and 200 in worship every week. But they also had a large contingent of high school kids there in worship that day because they were leaving to go to the Montreat Youth Conference. And so they were being commissioned and leaving right after church. They were a lovely group of people who, the folks that left, they are at something like 228 East Main Street. The folks that left started a church at 245 West Main Street. So right down, literally on the other side of the square from downtown. And they still see each other in the grocery stores and don't speak, and all of that fun stuff. Their pastor did not leave with the group, and their vote was about 50-50. 50 voted to stay, 50% voted to leave. And so that's how the split broke out there. But the pastor didn't go with the group that left. However, 6 months after the split, the pastor announced he was retiring. He was an older man, and it just took too much out of him. And then it was 7 or 9 years before they got a pastor. Now, they had someone, I think it was 7 years. The Presbyterian came in and had a supply pastor, put a supply pastor in place. That supply pastor was there for 2 years. And that's when they finally gave them permission to look for an interim. And after a year of searching, they found an interim, and the interim came and served 3 years. And then they were finally given permission to search for a permanent pastor. And she started right at the end of 2019, right before COVID. So they'd had a rough road. They had also found out in the middle of all this that their church administrator had embezzled like a couple $100,000 from them by saying that she was paying the taxes to the government, but instead she was putting that money in her own account. So in addition to losing that $200,000, they owed the government $200,000, and they didn't have an endowment. All they had was $300,000. So they were in rough financial shape. When I asked them what kept them going during this, and at each of these places I met with the pastor, some staff members, and some session members or leaders of the church, sometimes all together, sometimes separately. When I asked them what kept them going, when the split happened, I said, what was it that kept you going? And they said, our youth program. They said, we were determined that our youth program, which was one of the best in the city, according to them, was not going to suffer. And in fact, when they hit financial hard times, they stopped most of their adult programming so that they could continue to pay the youth person to have a youth program. So the adults sacrificed for the youth to make sure that the youth had everything they needed to continue to be a viable program, which showed in the 15 high school students that we saw who were getting ready to go to Montreat that Sunday, that had indeed paid off. So they made whatever sacrifices they needed to make. They did without in lots of different places so that they could continue that. That was pretty inspiring, I thought. They're worried about their future. Nobody's moving to Fountain Inn, South Carolina, they tell me. And so when we got there, nobody knew we were coming except for the pastor and the people we were going to meet with. And they descended upon us like flies to a bug zapper. And I mean, here's a gift. We give this to all our new members. And I was like, we're just visiting. And no, take these gifts. And and everybody was really interested in who we were and where we were from until they found out I was a Presbyterian pastor, and then they just ignored us for the rest of the day. No, well, I'm teasing.
See what happened?
I'm teasing. No, they were lovely people, and they were open and they were friendly, but you could really sense, I don't want to say desperation, is it the right word? It was genuine and authentic, their friendliness, but they know that they're in trouble, and they're really wanting new people to come, and they don't know how to make that happen. Where they're finding excitement and energy now is by, they have a beautiful facility, very large building like this one with a gym and all sorts of classrooms. And where they are finding, I asked every place this, where do you see God working now? Where is the excitement and the energy now? They all pointed to the fact that their building is being used for ministries. Now, these are not ministries that they have started or that their members are even actually involved in. But they have opened their building up to different ministries in town who need a place where they can operate out of. And so, for instance, there's a feeding ministry that offers free meals to anyone who wants to come and get them. It is just spread by word of mouth. The first week they opened was this summer, not long before we were there, and they had served 15 meals in one day. And it was kind of like we do with Compassionate Cuisine. They cook and they bring food and then they put it in to-go boxes. But then instead of going out the door and taking it out somewhere, people just pull up and they give them in the car, however many they want. So the first week they had done 15. We were there. They were about 10 weeks into this ministry, and they had 75 people come through. So it was a growing ministry, and they were thrilled. And some of the members had actually joined in that ministry. It wasn't a ministry of the church, but some of the members were cooking and serving those meals. So, and they had a whole bunch of other things like that were happening throughout the week, where they had said to the community, please come use our building. It's here, it's available, it's not being used. So that they were very excited about that. They found a lot of energy there. The second place I went was First Presbyterian Church, Columbus, Georgia. This congregation is the one that is most like ours. They were about the same size before their split as we were before ours, about 650 members. After the split, they said that the pastor said, we've got 400 members on the roll, but we're nowhere near that. We've never cleaned out our rolls. What they do have is about 100 people in worship on Sunday morning. The people that left, started a congregation, the pastor resigned, and then went and became their pastor. Interestingly enough, this was the church where I did my summer internship when I was in seminary. So I knew some people there. Not many that were there, but when I walked in, the first person I met saw there, they had a little reception table when you walk in the building, and it was Mrs. Bickerstaff, who I remembered, and once I told her who I was, she remembered me. But like some here, Mrs. Bickerstaff's children and grandchildren had left with the split and had gone to the other church. In fact, her daughter was the one who sort of led the thing. And so she was very sad about that. I went to a Sunday school class, and right away, they didn't know why I was there, but in that Sunday school class, it was one of the first things to come up during the discussion was the split that had happened. It was still very recent in their memory. They had brought in the moderator of the General Assembly to try to hold the congregation together, and that didn't work. And their split happened just a few months after this one. This church has a huge endowment, and they are using money from that endowment to fund the budget, kind of like we use the Kerry Ross Trust Fund to fund our budget, fund some of our budget. But they also have a big TV ministry. They've been on TV in Columbus, Georgia, which is the second largest city in Georgia. And they've had this TV ministry for 30 years, and that costs about $120,000 a year. And they're using their endowment for all of that. That's not part of the budget. They're using their endowment for that. When I asked them what kept them going after the split, their answer was spite. They said, we wanted to prove the people wrong that left, because they left and said, you'll be closed in 3 months. You'll never be able to pay the bills without us. There's no way you're going to survive. They had an interim come in, and he was there for a couple of years before their permanent pastor came in. An interesting thing that you don't often see, the presbytery insisted that the interim pastor and the incoming pastor overlap by 2 months. So the pastor coming in, his name was Danny, he was able to have 2 months with the interim so that interim could help him understand what all had happened since the split and sort of where the lay of the land was. They also had embezzlement issues, had the same sort of thing in almost the exact same way, and they were dealing with that. Where they're finding energy and excitement now is they hired a DCE, and so the DCE is energizing the children's programs and the high school and middle school programs. They don't have a lot of elementary children or high school and middle school programs, but they have part of their building is used for a housing ministry to help people find affordable housing who can't afford it. And so one of the things that they've done is they've reached out to the children of those families. So those families are using some of the things at the church as after-school care. They've started a tutoring ministry, and that tutoring ministry is providing a service to those families. So not all of the children and youth involved at First Presbyterian Columbus are members of the church or part of the church, but it's some mixture of kids from the community and members' kids. So that's where they're finding it. But their big question is, how are we going to survive? Because they, unlike Second, their members are not able to fund the budget. This is something that I found that was pretty unique, is that you all are extremely generous, and we've had a surplus every year since the split because of the combination of the generosity of the members and good stewardship on behalf of the committees and the staff. And that combination has kept us in the black. Every one of these other churches is in the red just on paper on their budget, and they don't know what to do about that. This is First Presbyterian Church of Longview, Texas, and my seminary friend Kendall Land is the pastor there. He's an LSU fan. I may or may not have texted him after the game. They were having their rally day the day that I was there. They still do rally day, and it was a breakfast. And so it was a wonderful opportunity for me to sit with some of the people who had been there for the split and ask a lot of good questions. One of them reminded me so much of Tim Wright. I sat with him for breakfast, and he looked like Tim. He had Tim's mannerisms. He was open and engaging like Tim, and he asked thoughtful questions like Tim. So that, golly, I got zapped. Somebody needs to fix that. Sorry, people at home. It's even worse in the room. This is where I heard a really great story. Longview, Texas is just across the Louisiana border. It's about an hour from Shreveport. But it is in Grace Presbytery, which is headquartered in Dallas. And Grace Presbytery consists of about 70 churches in the Dallas area, and then about 8 or 9 churches that are really far away from Dallas. So Dallas was 2.5, 3 hours away, I think, from Longview, something like that. They had their vote on a Saturday, and following the vote, which didn't achieve the number of votes necessary, and people knew that was going to happen, following that, the entire staff of the church resigned. The pastor, the associate pastor, the youth director, the director of music, the choir director, the youth director, did I say youth director? And both administrative assistants. All resigned. And that's because they had already decided they were going to start a new church, and the people who were leaving told them, we've got the money to keep paying your salary. And so the people left for their jobs. It wasn't ideology. They left because they needed to keep their jobs. So this church was decimated and devastated. That all happened on a Saturday. The presbytery had already told the session, we will have somebody to preach on tomorrow morning. Don't worry about that. Not only did they have someone to preach, but there were people from every congregation in Grace Presbytery who showed up for worship on Sunday morning. The sanctuary was packed, and it was packed with people, some of whom had driven 4 to 5 hours to get there. It was the way Grace Presbytery said, we are connectional, we are Presbyterian, this is what it means to be Presbyterian, and we're going to get you through this. And to hear those people tell that story gave me goosebumps. It made me cry. It's about to make me cry right now just telling it, because I think it is one of the most beautiful stories I've ever heard about what it means to truly be Presbyterian and to understand that as a Presbyterian. They also may have felt a little bit guilty because Highland Park Presbyterian Church in Dallas had convinced Longview to leave the denomination, because this happened in 2011 before there was an ECO. And so Highland Park wanted to leave, but it didn't know what was going to happen in the courts, and so they were trying to convince Longview to leave to be a test case. And so they manipulated, the pastors there were working with the pastors at Highland Park Presbyterian Church through the whole thing. And they were Highland Park was pretty shocked that Longview didn't vote to leave. In Fountain Inn, Columbus, and the other one I told you about, all of them were over the issues of sexuality, but they were all hypothetical. It was, the denomination has now voted to allow homosexuals to be ordained, or later in 2014, allow homosexuals to be married. This is a travesty. This is heresy. We shouldn't allow this, and we need to leave the denomination. But in none of those congregations was there a homosexual person who wanted to be ordained or get married. Longview was the only one that was different. In 2011, so there were two young ladies who grew up in the church at Longview, had spent their entire childhood, middle school and high school time as members of the youth group, members of the church. These two ladies went away to college separately. While at college, they both realized that they were gay and came out. After college, they graduated and they both moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, and reconnected and fell in love. And they wanted to go home to their home church and get married. Both of their families were still members of the church. Some of those members of families were even on the session. So when they said, we want to come back home and get married, there were some in the church who remembered them fondly and said, of course, these are young women that we love and care for. Of course they should get married here. And there were some people who said, absolutely not. There's no way that should ever happen. And so that's what led to the split in Longview, Texas. It wasn't a hypothetical. It was a very real situation. So as you might imagine, it was a very painful situation in a whole different way because it was very personal to those families. When I asked them what got them through the split, the guy that reminded me of Tim Wright says, I have no idea. When I asked the pastor, he said, I really don't know. They could not articulate what got them through. What excites them about right now is they're in conversations. There are 3 Presbyterian churches in Longview, Texas. First Presbyterian has the most attendance, and they have about 60 on a Sunday. The others have less than 30. And so there was talk about the 3 of them merging. And that was very exciting, to merge and have one building. The sticking point, guess what? Guess what it was? Yeah, nobody wants to give up their building. Nobody wants to give up their building. So they're all like, well, we're glad to merge as long as you come here. But they're excited about the possibility that might happen. The last church I visited was in Enid, Oklahoma. And I got to say, I went to Oklahoma City first for a conference sponsored by the Covenant Network of Presbyterians. The conference was called Signs of Hope, Embodying God's Love and Justice. It was mainly conversations on how churches can be better at inclusion, especially inclusion of LGBTQI plus people. And so all of the plenary session and the workshops were designed to talk about how we can be more inclusive. So it was a enlightening conference. But I got to tell you this quick story. I don't know how we're doing on time. How are we doing on time? Okay. All right. I got to tell you this real quick story. So one of the workshops that I went to, there were 3 workshops, and the last one that I went to was how to get your congregations to talk about being inclusive. And so I was like, well, this is great. This will be a good one to go to. And so I went, and the facilitator came up, and she talked about, the most important thing that we can do to be inclusive is to listen to other people. And it's really important to listen to the stories that other people have. And she says, so here's what I want you to do. Everybody pair up with someone that you didn't come here with. Well, that wasn't a problem for me. And just real quickly, tell each other the story of how you ended up in leadership at your church. And don't say, somebody wrote me into it. There's a reason you're a leader in your church, and tell that story to another person. So very quickly, everybody starts pairing up, and I turn to the guy on my left, but he's already talking to the woman on his right. I turn to this guy on my right, and I say, hey, you want to be partners? And he says, actually, I'm more interested in listening to their conversation. Well, I found out later it was because he was, there were 3 presbyteries that hosted this. He was the executive presbyter of one presbytery, and the 2 people in front of him were his wife and the executive presbyter of one of the other presbyteries. So he said, I want to listen to them. So I was like, okay. So I looked around, and I stood up, and I raised my hand, and I said, I need a friend. And no one, nobody responded. So I was like, okay, I've been here before. I'm a big boy. So I sat down, and I started texting people and, doing what you do on your phone in times like that. So the lady comes back, and she goes, okay, everybody finish up. She goes, so, it's really important that we listen to people if we want to be inclusive. And then she asked a series of questions about ourselves, and she was like, I want you to think about this and this and this. And she goes, now, partner up with who you were partnered up with before and share your answers to these questions. And I stood up and walked out of the room and left. I thought, boy, at a conference on inclusion, where the focus was on how we can be inclusive of everybody, I was excluded.
Why didn't you say that?
Well, that's exactly what my wife said. Because I called her, I got in the car, and I said, I'm just going on to Enid earlier than I thought. And I called her to tell her about it, and she said, you should have said something. You should have found them. Well, I didn't say anything for this reason. The response would have been, oh, you poor middle-aged straight white man, you're so oppressed. You're so excluded. That would have been the response. It would not have been sympathy. And it would not have changed anything, because I'm not a member of that presbytery. So there's not going to be any ongoing conversation. But what I chose to take from it was this, that God needed me to learn this lesson. That even when we think we are being as inclusive as we can possibly be, we are still in danger of leaving somebody out because of our personal biases and because of our personal agendas. I guarantee you, if I had been a different gender or a different race, someone would have answered me when I said that. But you know what? Including everybody means including everybody. And so at any moment in any given room when we're together as a church, we all should be looking around saying, who is not being included? And we need to do what we can to make sure that they are included. Because even when we're trying to be welcoming, faithful, and hopeful, someone might experience us as not welcoming, and we may never know because they'll do what I did. They'll walk out the door and we'll never hear from them again. So I took it as a positive lesson of something just to be cognizant of, that we are always in danger of excluding somebody. So let's always, in addition to saying, who can we include, also say, who are we excluding, and work to fix that.
This is a great experience for you to feel what it feels like to be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's not the first time. I've felt excluded plenty in my life, believe me.
Oh, no.
But yeah. Don't get me started on elementary school gym class and the baseball team. I'll be up here crying. Anyway, so I drove, but I do want to say this. Other than the people who were trying to be inclusive, I've never met friendlier people than live in Oklahoma City. Everywhere I went, I thought Knoxville was friendly. My goodness. People in Oklahoma City, from the gas station attendants to the hotel people, to no matter where I went, people were friendly and engaging, and they asked how you were doing and meant it, and you knew that they meant it. And that held true for Enid, Oklahoma, which is an hour and a half north of Oklahoma City, in Cimarron Presbytery, which is a very small presbytery. The folks in Enid, they're in a tough spot. Not a lot of people moving to Enid, Oklahoma. And they want to grow, but there's not a lot of people there that they can pull from. They're not like Knoxville that has tons of people moving in. they had their split. The pastor sort of led the charge. The pastor decided the Presbyterian church is wrong and we need to leave. And what the session members told me was that before the pastor said anything, there really wasn't a lot of conflict at the church. People weren't really upset. But once the pastor planted his flag in the ground and said, we need to leave, a lot of people got angry. A lot of people got upset. And this may sound familiar, the session decided that it needed to, might need to look at leaving the denomination, so they decided they were going to hold a couple of open discussion sessions. And they said, we're thinking about this and we want to come and we want to have dialogue to see where you are on this. And one of the elders told me that she went to the first session that they had, and it very quickly became apparent that the session didn't want to hear what they had to say. The session wanted to tell them what was going to happen. And so she called her husband, who is a lawyer, and says, what can we do? And so they got busy lawyering and figuring out how they were going to navigate this thing. They got in touch with the Presbytery. Presbytery got involved trying to mediate this. But eventually there was a vote, and a lot of people left. The vote didn't make, and a lot of people left. And then the pastor decided, he had told the people who were leaving that he was going to go with them. And then when he found out that he would lose his pension, he decided to stay. So you can imagine how awkward that was, that all of these people had left, the congregation had split, and the pastor who had started it all still wanted to be the pastor of the congregation. Well, that's what happened. They called the Presbytery, and members of the Committee on Ministry showed up on the next Sunday at worship. They didn't disrupt the worship service. They let the guy preach the sermon. And then they went and met him in his office and said, you have just preached your last sermon in this Presbyterian church. So he was still in town. He was an elected official. He had run for office, but he was no longer a Presbyterian minister. They worked something out. This was a place where one of the elders told me, because the general presbyter was there for this meeting when I met with the members of the session and some other leaders. He kept referring to them as the faithful remnant. And that is language that the Presbyterian Church uses and has used across the board. You'll notice I've never used it here, but he said it in the meeting, and boy, she ripped his head off. She said, I am so tired of hearing this presbytery call us the faithful remnant. We are not a remnant, we are the church. And I loved it. I was like, ooh, you go. And then I told her after the meeting, if you ever want to relocate to Knoxville, I know a great church for you. The people there were just super friendly, but they're tired. They had the smallest group in worship of any of the churches I visited. They had about 25 people in worship. They had a pastor who came. They had a very short interim, I think less than a year. They called a pastor right out of seminary. That was absolutely the wrong move. The Presbyterian should never have allowed that. He came in there, and after 9 years, he was burnt out and left. And so they had an interim there once again while I was there. And they were very sad because this pastor that a lot of people really loved had left and gone back to New York, which is where he was from. So they were hurting. They were hurting, and they don't know how they're going to pay their bills, and they don't know what they're going to do. When I asked them what kept them going through the split, they said, what else would we do? Which I thought was interesting. When I asked them where the excitement was now, the answer was, there's not any. Which was just really sad to me, because these are beautiful people, and just so friendly and open and welcoming. One of the ladies that was in the meeting said, can I have your number? Because she's going to be the chair of their pastor nominating committee. She wanted to ask me some questions. And that night, Sunday night, I had just gotten in the car to go try to find some place to eat, and the phone rang, and it was her, and she said, look, My kids and grandkids are coming over for dinner. We're going to cook out burgers. You want to come over? And so I went over to her house and met her family, and they're just, super great people, but they're just so sad and they're hurting. This was the place where one lady who had just rotated off the session asked me, how are those of us in this situation going to survive? And as I said a few weeks ago, that seems to be on everybody's mind. And what I told her was, I don't know. I don't have a magic bullet. I don't have an answer for that. But I know we're not going to survive alone. And we're going to need each other. And that's, I think, the thing that I was really, after visiting these congregations, I realized that prior to this, I was feeling very overwhelmed and like there was really nobody to talk to except for Sarah Morgan, because she's the only person I know who is trying to pastor a congregation in the years following a very painful and hurtful split. And there's not a book on this out there. There aren't people that you can turn to. There aren't gurus. But now there are 4 other pastors that I'm in conversation with. And we've decided to start a quarterly Zoom call for mutual support and benefit, where we can learn from each other and encourage each other and share ideas, what's working, what's not working. And I no longer feel alone, and I no longer feel overwhelmed, but I feel like we have a community and that we share a lot in common with. I could go on for the next hour about the commonalities and the differences in these congregations, but it was just a blessing where I was going, thinking I was going to learn from them some tricks that I could bring back here. Instead, I went and created community with other people who are asking the same questions as us, and realized that we can all help each other, all of us. And so that was a great benefit. Well, I'll see if you guys have any questions, but I do want to say this, and I've said it to a few people. I said I wasn't going to say it to a larger group of people, but I reconsidered that this afternoon. In June, so here's what I realized, is prior to going on sabbatical, I was even more burnt out, more stressed out, and experiencing more compassion fatigue than I realized. I knew all those 3 things were happening, but I was faking my way through it. And I thought it was just a little bit. I learned on sabbatical it was a lot. It was a whole lot. And in June, I was just a blubbery mess. I couldn't think. I was just trying to find things to do, to relax and have fun and reconnect with my family. And so in June, I didn't think much about my ministry at all. In July, my thoughts were along the lines of, it feels really good not to be a pastor. I think I'm done with ministry. I thought I'm going to go back and I'm going to do my year, because I love those people at Second Presbyterian Church, and I promised them a year after sabbatical, but I'm going to let them know that I'm leaving the ministry at the end of that year. And I didn't know what I was going to do, but it was going to be anything other than being a minister. Then August came along, and I began to, in the middle of my reading and conversations, think, oh, we could do this at Second. And then I would go worship somewhere, and I would go, ooh, we should do that at Second. Or I would go, oh, we're doing that much better at Second. That happened a lot too. And then I began to have ideas for ministries and ideas for ways that we could connect with each other and ways that we could be the church together. And then at some point I started thinking about people. I wonder how so-and-so's doing. I'm not going to call any names. I wonder how I wonder how so-and-so's doing. Maybe I'll just text Sarah and ask her how so-and-so is. No, I'm not going to do that. And at some point in August, I realized I really missed you all. And that I really love you all. And that I really like being with you all. And I like serving you all. And I like being here with you. And I realized by the third week of August that I was really ready to come back. And not just ready, but excited to come back. And so my last week of sabbatical, I even said to Tuesday, you think maybe I could just come and slip in the back at second and worship there? And she said, you probably could, but you'll be swamped. And I was like, yeah, I better not. So I was like, I know, the only thing I haven't done this summer is worship somewhere virtually. I'll worship virtually with second. And even then, I couldn't resist. Sarah called me out on it during the service. I was texting her during the service. And she told you all. So the reason I tell you that is the sabbatical accomplished what it was supposed to accomplish, which was re-energizing, recreating, rest, and renewal. It accomplished all of those things. So hopefully, over the next few months, you'll realize that you got your money's worth. But I do want to say thank you to the session, to the pastoral relations team, to you, the congregation, who made it possible for me to have this gift. And I know I already said that my first Sunday back, but it was my first Sunday back. I forgot two really important thank yous, and that is to Sarah Morgan and the staff of Presbyterian, Second Presbyterian Church, who kept things going. And what I can tell you is because I trust Sarah so completely, I never thought about or worried about a thing. Because I thought even if something goes wrong, she can handle it. She can take care of it. And I really, people are like, did you have a hard time pulling away? Did you have a hard time stepping away? I didn't, not at all. Not at all. And I promise you, in June, I didn't think about you one single bit. And then very little in July, because I knew things were going to be okay here because of Sarah and the rest of the staff. So I've neglected to say that my first Sunday back, so I wanted to say it now. So, I said the session. I said the session. I said the session and you all, and I said that both times. But the last time I didn't say the staff and the congregation. Yeah. I mean the staff and Sarah. So I know it's been a long time. That was like an hour. So, but if you have questions or anything, I'll be glad to answer them.
Can I just say something?
Yeah.
I had no idea what that one middle part of what you thought you said. You didn't tell me.
No, I
feel
didn't.
Like you weren't
No, because I knew it would scare you to death.
No, you told me later. You said, you do what? You thought what? I had no idea. So I had no idea.
No, I knew it would scare her to death.
Yeah, it would have scared me to death.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah.
For not I'm sorry you had to go through it alone, but whatever.
For those of you at home who couldn't hear, my wife said that she was glad that I didn't tell her that what was happening in July.
Yeah, I had no idea. Was it restful for you? Yes. I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about having him at home all summer. Because I'm always real lazy and don't worry about being lazy because there's no one there to catch me being lazy. But he was a lot of fun.
Yeah, at some point in July, she looked at me and she said, you know, I really like Sabbatical, Tim. Yeah. Yeah, Cheryl.
I'm excited to hear what ideas you have for us going forward. What we can do to fit in with that.
Yeah. I'm excited too about sharing them in the right time, at the right time, in the right way. But I will tell you this, one of the things I became convinced of in all my travels and my studies, my reading, my writing, my thinking, is that it's got to be about the relationships. A lot of churches, and maybe even this church in the past, it has been about the programs and the ministries offered. The way forward is not programs and ministries. The way forward is relationships. Building relationships, creating relationships, continuing relationships, digging into relationships, providing opportunities for relationships. That's the way forward. That's what God did in Jesus Christ. Jesus called 12 individuals together. They lived in relationship and community for 3 years. And then Jesus left and said, okay, now go do this. He didn't leave a golden curriculum. He didn't leave a list of programs. He lived in community with people for 3 years and said, okay, this is the church. Go be the church. And when the church has been at its strongest and best, and when congregations are at their strongest and best, the primary focus is on building relationships with each other and with others. And most of my ideas come from the fruit of that tree. Yeah, Bruce.
Those people ask you now what's the way forward, now you have an answer.
Well, yeah, but I don't know the way forward. I mean, I think that is the key to the way forward. Yeah, but again, no silver bullet, no magic bullet. It's going to be a long, slow process for everybody. No shortcuts. No shortcuts when you're building relationships.
You know, this is just a comment, but if you've been a psychologist or you've been a teacher or a principal, and if you haven't taught, then you don't have a clue what I'm saying, not just being a doctor or something like that. If you really take your job seriously, when the end of April hits, or the end of May hits, you don't get this, and Knoxville, a lot of the places where you've had it. I mean, you have had it. And what? You're empty. You're empty if you've done your job. And you know, the thing about it is that I would equate, you know, 'cause I come up here and shoot the boys' skin, so I don't lay all my cards. You know, half of it's just talking. You know, whatever. But the thing about it is I would think that somebody in the ministry, you know, in the profession, ought to be given at a minimum 6 to 8 weeks off every year anyway. I mean, to me, that should be a gift. I mean, it should be a gift. That's something that I think. So,
Well, everybody
yeah.
is working. I mean, we're a society of workaholics. You go to Europe, they don't work like we do. They don't put in the hours. They take a month to 2 weeks off every year. But we're crazy.
Well, but those European countries have governments that support that too. Yeah. Any other questions? I'll be glad. Yeah, Doug. No, that's the one thing I didn't get to do. So well, it's one of two things I didn't get to do. I think I said there were some things I did that I hadn't planned on doing, which were blessings, but there were a couple of things that I didn't get to do, and one of them was that the Abbey of Gethsemane takes reservations only a couple of months ahead of time. And so when I sent in my request in April to be there in July or August, they said check back in May. And when I sent in my request in May, they said we're full. So I didn't get to go that, but I created my own silent retreat. The thing about the Abbey is for many, many years, every year I would go to the Abbey and make a week-long silent retreat. I created my own silent retreat. I told you I went to First Presbyterian Church Columbus and First Presbyterian Church Longview. I went there a week apart. I was in Columbus, Georgia on one Sunday. I was in Longview the next Sunday. Those two towns are not very far apart. It's a very drivable distance. But what I decided to do was drive very slowly from one to the other and stop every day and play golf. So I drove to Auburn and I played golf. And then I drove to the next town, which was Montgomery. And then I got there in the afternoon and I was in my hotel room working on my book all night. And then I got up the next morning and played golf in Montgomery. And then I drove to Jackson, Mississippi. And then I was in my hotel room all night working on my book. And then I got up the next morning and drove to Delhi, Louisiana. And I played golf there. And only one of these was I put with another group of people. So I was playing golf by myself in the morning, and then in my hotel room by myself all evening writing. And so I made my way over to Longview So I had a week that was essentially a silent retreat of playing golf and writing. So it was lovely. It was just lovely. Margie.
So in reflection, and you've had a great time to do that, what would be a bit of counsel you would give to us?
Well, first of all, I would echo kind of what Jeff and Kathy were saying. And I think other professions outside of teaching in the ministry are starting to recognize the value of building Sabbath into the careers. But that, I mean, heck, I mean, it's right there in the Ten Commandments, isn't it? Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. We're not meant to be 24/7 producing and consuming, get all you can get people. The Lord created us to have a day of rest. And there are so many studies that show this out there that show people are most productive when they have one day off a week. Our pattern here in America is 5 days on and then 2 days off. People are actually less productive with 2 days off than they are with 1 day off. And if you read the Old Testament, it talks about every 7 years that these sort of things are supposed to happen. And I think we should take that seriously. That would be my first. And I'm preaching to the choir, you know, that we need to guard Sabbath time and protect it and observe it. And that doesn't mean a day off where you just lay around and watch TV. It doesn't mean a day off where you run errands and get the oil changed and take your laundry to the laundry. It means a time to reconnect with God, either through reading or being in nature or cooking or gardening or doing something creative that connects us with the holy. And if we do that on a regular basis and build time into our schedules to reflect on that, the reflection is the other part. Rest and reflect, connect and reflect. Then I think we will find ourselves more at peace, more open to what God is doing in our lives, more spiritually fulfilled, and more in touch with our calling from God. So that would be my first one. My second would be not to us as individuals, but to us as a congregation. That, first of all, I just want to say, you know, this is horrible. This is horrible. God forgive me for what I'm about to say.
Oh my gosh, what are you going to say?
I visited these 5 congregations, and I haven't even scratched the surface on some of the pain and dysfunction and heartache and turmoil that these congregations experience. And my heart went out to them, but at the same time, in every place, I was thinking, I am so glad that I'm at Second Presbyterian Church, Knoxville. I'm so glad that that's where I am, because we're doing okay. So that would be my mind to the congregation. I know that people are anxious. I know that, you know, I've been asked at least once a month for the last 6 years, what's your plan for growth? What's your plan for growth? We got to get more people. Why aren't more people showing up? How can we get more people? And I would just say, you know what? Relax. We're doing okay, especially compared to the other 4. I know when we look at Westminster, we may not think we're doing okay, but when we look at these other 4, we're all right, let me tell you. No, seriously, we're doing okay. This is a good congregation with people who have good connections. We love each other. We care for one another. We do good things for God in this world. And we don't need to be anxious. God holds the future. All we've got to do is, in every moment, be as faithful to God as we can. And the future will take care of itself. Survival will take care of itself. We just need to be focused on being welcoming, faithful, and hopeful. And if we can be welcoming, faithful, and hopeful, all the rest of it will fall into place. And that's really, I kind of came away from Sabbatical with that. I've been too worried about how am I going to help this congregation survive. That's not my job. My job is not to help this congregation survive. My congregation is to love this congregation and serve this congregation and care for this congregation and provide opportunities for the members of this congregation to grow spiritually. God will take care of the rest. And so that would be my other piece of advice. Don't be anxious. Be thankful. Be grateful, because this is the church. We are the church. I kind of alluded to this a couple of weeks ago, you know, that every congregation has these 2 groups of people, and one group thinks we're not really church because we're not doing all the things that we used to do. No, we are church right now, right here, the way we are. And this is a beautiful expression of church, and I'm really thankful for it, and I know you are too. So don't let your idea of what church is supposed to be get in the way of appreciating how we are the church now. Thank you for that question. Yeah.
When you were telling stories of the other workers, I was struck by both how good and how very unkind and spiteful and mean people who out from Christians can be.
Yeah. It's disappointing. Yeah.
But I can say I have never felt anything but welcome. And
I'm glad you've had that feeling.
I'm really gratified.
Yeah. I think we all are, but especially those who've come in the last few years. They don't have that baggage. Yeah. Oh, and by the way, three of us who had the split, the congregation that left, named themselves Grace Presbyterian Church. 3 of them. Isn't that nuts? They didn't show any grace to people on the way out the door, and they won't show grace to some people who come into their doors, but they name themselves Grace. That's bad on. Shame on me. Shame on me. I just thought it was ironic. Yeah, Joe.
Earlier you talked about inclusion and another grouping. You spoke about your observation of being on the other side, looking at the congregation. At the time you mentioned 2 of them, I remember in particular, passing of the peace, and also the office.
Yeah, so what Joe is speaking of, when I talked to the session, one of the things that I didn't mention here tonight is that every Sunday except for 2, I worshiped somewhere. One Sunday, I decided that I was going to go play golf on a Sunday morning with all the other golfing heathens. And the other Sunday was when we were in Bon Air and we were scuba diving. Other than that, I was in worship somewhere, usually here in Knoxville, usually a Methodist or an Episcopalian church, once over with the UCC folks at Church of the Savior. And then these congregations. And I wrote about this. You can read this in my newsletter. That's why I didn't really want to spend too much time on it tonight. Read my newsletter article from the October newsletter. It was really eye-opening to go into a different place each week to worship with a group of Christians, none of whom I knew. And to realize the anxieties that I had about that, even as a lifelong Christian and a pastor, to realize the questions that I had and were interested in having answered, and then also how I was received and welcomed, and where I felt included and where I felt excluded, where I felt comfortable and where I felt extremely uncomfortable. And recognizing those things then made me think about us and the job that we do. And I got to say, for the most part, that we're doing better than a lot of congregations at making sure people are welcome. This past Sunday, my best friend from high school surprised me and came to worship. That's who I ran down to hug during the passing of the peace. And he said to me after, he and his wife, he said, man, I got to tell you, he said, this congregation is the friendliest congregation I've ever seen. He goes, so many people came up to us and welcomed us and said they were glad that we were here. And you've got a really great, loving congregation. That was his experience, and that's unsolicited. So we're doing a good job. But what Joe's referring to is the 2 times across the board in every situation where I felt very uncomfortable. One was the passing of the peace. It's just terrible. It's just terrible when you're a visitor to a congregation and don't know anybody. Because either you're worried about nobody speaking to you and nobody does, in which case you feel ostracized and isolated, or more people come up to you than you want them to and you feel overwhelmed, or in one case at a church here in Knoxville, it was when COVID was high and I was wearing my mask and I stood up for the passing of the peace and I had my hands in my pocket like this, and I had my mask on and I was kind of hunched inward like this. I mean, everything about my body language said, you can speak to me but nothing else, right? I had 2 women try to hug me. And 3 people, how you doing? Is put their hands out to shake it. And I was like, what about this says shake my hand, right? And so then you have to kind of go, and it just makes you feel so awkward. It makes you feel so bad. And then, in some places, I stood up and someone would come over and, oh, hey, it's really glad to have you here. And I'd go, oh, thank you. And then they would turn away, and then I'd turn around and nobody else, And so then you just kind of, hey, just sit back down and do whatever. So I never, now I'm an introvert. That may surprise you, I know, because I've learned to look like an extrovert to fool you. But naturally, I'm an introvert. So some of that is my introverted nature. But some of that is real if we think about people who are scared and nervous about coming to church and how it is that they experience that time that we call the passing of the peace. The other one was absolutely the offering, and I've already mentioned it on a Sunday morning. I rarely have cash, almost never have cash. And I never remembered on the way to worship to stop and get cash. And so then when it came time for the offering, I was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And so what you do is you put your head down and try to close your eyes, and you hope that the usher takes the hint and passes you by. But what I can tell you is not all the ushers have been trained to do that, and sometimes that plate was under my nose. And so then you have to go, I don't. And so then I'm thinking, well, they're going to think that I'm a cheapskate, or that I don't appreciate them. And then, like in the congregations where I knew that they knew I was a pastor, that they would be thinking, well, that pastor is, and it's just like I felt a shame and judgment. And not that anybody was thinking that, but that's what I felt. That, I felt shame and judgment until I went to a congregation where in the bulletin it said, if you wish to leave an offering in person, the offering plates are at the entrances to the sanctuary. If you wish to leave an offering virtually, here's a QR code and our Venmo. And so I was able to take out my phone, snap a picture of the QR code, and send that church $25. And they didn't have a time for the offering during the service. They just trusted that people would read that and do that. And it was wonderful, because then we didn't have that time when I felt ashamed to not have any money. So that's what Joe's talking about. Yeah. All right, it's been a long night, and it's dark and cold outside, so thank you for being here. If any of you guys want to go to lunch and talk in more depth about any of this, especially any of those churches I've visited, I would love to have those conversations. And I, too, look forward to continuing to share things that the sabbatical gave me that I was not expecting. Just wonderful gifts, wonderful gifts. I can't thank you enough for the gift that you gave me. And I love you all. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. If any of you are still online, thanks for joining us. I imagine